Despite this war in me, despite this war in me. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. I'm your host, Smooth Caramel, and I talk about rap, so that's what I'm gonna do. This weekend, or the weekend I'm filming this, I was awoken to a message from a good friend of mine that let me know of a new album from one Kid Cudi. And me not being a morning person, while excited, it took me a few minutes to regain the level of consciousness to really understand the magnitude of as a statement. With that in mind, once I had managed to roll out of bed, picked up my phone to take a look at what was on offer here, and coincidentally but unsurprisingly, one of the first things I saw was Spotify advertising this very album, Man on the Moon 3, The Chosen, with the tagline, "The trilogy continues." And this was a good tagline because it immediately took me back to Man on the Moon, one of my favorite Kid Cudi albums, probably my most favorite Kid Cudi album. One of my favorite albums at the time. Took me back to roaming those London streets with my headphones on and just getting lost in that surreal musical texture that Kid Cudi seems to weave quite often. The album artwork as well was very much to my liking, with that kind of abstract feel to it and fluid-like strokes of color that combined it very nicely. Also somewhat a color palette that I would like for my channel, but that's beside the point. One day when there's real production value. So after a man had went about his business for the day, I had to get to listening to this album. Now this was a very interesting listening experience. Both very much what I expected, but also not what I expected. But I'll briefly explain my history with Kid Cudi to just provide a bit of context. Now, the aforementioned Man on the Moon is my favorite Kid Cudi album, but it's also the only one that I really got into as an album in its entirety, where I listened to it from beginning to end, and I have a decent knowledge of near every song. Since then, I just stumbled across Kid Cudi from time to time over the years. And with that being my relationship with the Kid Cudi discography, it means I have a less informed perspective for how he may have changed gradually over time. So expect my references or comparisons to previous works to be mostly from that album. Alright, so let us commence the review. So my most immediate thought for this album was that the production was mostly what I expected. It was very atmospheric with more loosely melodic foundations. It really helps create that more sensational experience through that formlessness and fluidity. Where this went more outside the realms of my expectations were in the more mechanical edges, particularly in the drum lines that were utilized that more resembled that which would be used for grime or trap. This was also accompanied by more digital sound effects, which I thought worked to varying levels of success in different songs among the album's choices. Now, I'm not a weed smoker myself,
I don't even smoke weed.
but I know that Kid Cudi is, and his music tends to have an influence because of that, and it will tend to be, let's say, more appealing to fellow weed smokers. Obviously, I can't know this firsthand, but it's very much what I consider to be common knowledge at this point. And to be honest, I've been wondering how to structure this as a review. The main issue being I've not been sure whether to go into more than a few songs in detail to give some more informed and specific opinions about the album, or to just talk about the more broader experience of the album. And that dilemma actually takes me on to my main criticism. Most of what I didn't like on this album was very apparent in a lot of songs in a lot of the same ways, which made me a little bit less able to look at these things on a more individual basis. In addition to that, though, it made these perceived issues, at least for me, feel a bit more accentuated because they kept occurring in these similar ways. However, with that said, I would also point out, as far as I found it, it came across a bit as an album of two halves. The first half of the album somewhat washed over me. I at times didn't even realize when I had moved on from one song to the next. And when I got to the second half of the album is when I really was able to distinguish between the entries and find things that I liked a bit more and things that annoyed me or irritated me a bit less. So the point where I was actually able to gain some level of enjoyment was actually during the mid to the second half of the album. So what specifically did I take issue with that I felt was more prevalent in the first half? Well, these might overlap a bit, but let me break it down. The vocal production is a little bit haphazard, which made the lyrics quite difficult to parse. Lots of reverb and auto-tune, which came across as quite laboured at times, particularly when Cudi was going for the lower of notes and it kind of hit my ear with the flatness, which I can relate to as well as someone that sings, but with some difficulty at times. The tracks didn't transition that well from one to the next, which sounds counterintuitive because I've said that they all sound very similar, but the points of those transitions didn't come across very well, especially relative, for example, to Busta Rhymes album. I mean, this was a feature I praised in my ELE2 review, and more broadly, it wasn't very substantive. Definitely sensational by intention, but I mean, there was not much to grab onto because of this lack of substance for me. I mean, a lot of the things I've just mentioned are fine, acceptable, ignorable here and there, but because, like I said, it was so prevalent, especially on that first half in the same ways, it did aggravate me a little bit overall when I was listening. And the reason I think this was the case is because these songs somewhat lacked a more grounded aspects to allow some level of accessibility. Just something to really anchor all of these otherwise free-flowing aspects and features. Because without that, it does end up feeling a little bit like a nebulous mass. And that is difficult to really grab onto, get a hold of. At least for a listener such as myself. To illustrate what I mean, I'm going to use Erase Me, one of my favourite Kid Cudi songs, as a reference. Because I think that as a Kid Cudi song is a lot more well held together. With Cudi not being the most lyrical of artists, the real resonance, especially emotionally, tends to come from the production and the delivery. In that song, the more natural musical sounds really gives it a sense of genuineness or sincerity, with those raw, somewhat unpolished vocals really adding to that sense of imperfection or fallibility. And this juxtaposes well against the overall scale and bombast of the overall musical production, which really convey and carry the weight of the feelings behind it. It ends up coming across saying something along the lines of, I'm not perfect, you're not perfect, but I need you because what we have is so strong. Or something to that effect. I mean, I didn't write this song. But despite that, I was able to get that just from my listening experience, and I couldn't really tell you a lot of what individual songs on the Kid Cudi album Man on the Moon 3 were really trying to convey. But to reiterate, it's that more grounded nature that lets the more genuine feelings come across. Sometimes raw and unrefined is good for really communicating that. To a certain degree though, because if you go further, then you end up in borderline comedy realms. Biz Markie comes to mind. You got what I need. But I'm not gonna go that far. But Erase Me is more on the traditionally musical end of the scale. If I were to refer to one that captures this more otherworldly feeling a little bit more, the outer space vibe, I would turn to Cudi's own from that first album again that I previously referenced, Man on the Moon. In that song, the lyrics are still more easily parsed, which allows them to really communicate what is actually meant through them, despite the very loose and sensational feel of the instrumental. Plus, that allows the flow to work with the lyrics and the instrumentation to properly convey what's being depicted, especially where the chorus is allowed to stand out a bit more, with a little more feeling and character. So in the majority of the album, I think I missed this accessibility that really allowed me to step into this otherworldly musical aesthetic. But before I go into the second half, I'm going to quickly introduce a point that I felt more while I was writing this as a script. I had the album playing while I was collating my notes and forming what I was trying to say to try and make it cohesive. And while I was more focused on the content of what I was writing, it allowed me to experience a more passive listening experience. And to be honest, I think I enjoyed that a bit more. I was more able to let the music wash over me and detach from other distracting sounds that may be affecting me while I was focused. The less decipherable lyrics even help in achieving this state because it adds to the sense of your perception being warped. And thus, listening to the music almost manages to breach your consciousness. Though I'm not sure whether I want to, or if I can, classify this as a good thing or not. For one thing, as far as I'm concerned, this was not a type of listening experience that I found to be pleasant or enjoyable for very long. I had to break it up. I'm a very attentive and tuned listener of music. And just naturally that being so, it means that things can only be played or perceived even passively for so long before the more attentive part of my brain really starts to pick up on these smaller, less prominent sounds that either build up to annoy me or build up to be enjoyed by recognizing specific patterns. I only wanted to make that point because I do often get told that I listen to things too hard or I'm too attentive when I listen to music. And I think this is a type of album where the difference is going to be very much in the way that I enjoyed it. So I kind of wanted to add it as a disclaimer. But on to what I thought more of the second half. Now, I'm not going to go as far as saying the second half was a massive step up, but it had more that I was able to get into, more that appealed to me. The aspects that I mentioned before were less pervasive, and it was a little bit more distinct, so with my attentive listening style, I was able to pick up on a bit more. These could have had some more to actually anchor the songs to some degree, but I'm not sure that these features were anchored to the same degree as in older songs that I enjoy a lot more. But to quickly go into the ones that stood out to me a little bit more. Elsie's Baby Boy, parentheses flashback. Quite an infectious melody with a more upbeat tempo. And it has a weird but somewhat understandable narrative to it that I was able to at least partially follow. I would say that it was arguably the most distinctive song on the album. Mr. Solo Dolo 3. The other two Mr. Solo Dolos I really like, and this one I did quite like. It captures that feeling of solitude very well, as in the previous renditions, particularly in how the production was quite muted and the vocals a lot less chaotic. And the last one, which I'm not even sure if I liked, but I replayed, Rockstar Nights, which had a more traditional song structure. Oh, that was another thing. Not a lot of the songs on the album had your traditional verse-chorus type structures, or at least that were very easily seen as such. But with the features, Rockstar Nights had a greater sense of intensity to it, an overall rap-like feeling. Had me nodding along with a bit more enthusiasm than the rest of the album. But with that, I didn't love any of these songs or any on the album, nor did I hate or strongly dislike any, so what can I really say to sum up my feelings towards it? It's definitely an album very much established by the sensations facilitated by the production, more than the lyrical content, for example. With this being the case, I think it is safe to say that it's more enjoyed passively, as opposed to more attentively or actively. Something that would be quite nice to listen to while you were busy focusing on something else, a task or a more demanding piece of media that you're consuming. And as I mentioned, the standout songs I would say are in the second half. The overall production, it reminded me a little bit of something between Travis Scott with the otherworldly kind of feelings that I heard on Sicko Mode, which again wasn't really for me. And the Kendrick Lamar with all the weird voice modulations he likes to employ, which varied in its execution. But the main takeaway for me would be that I thought it did lack some substance. I mean, I listened to every song, but I didn't get much of a feeling of what they were about or what emotions were trying to be presented. And maybe I just didn't receive them or perceive them as well as I should have. But that in itself could be because of the songs themselves and the production not allowing me to through some means. But who knows, maybe it's one that will build or grow on me over time. Or maybe I just need some weed. But okay, I shall leave it there. Thanks for listening, and this has been another Smooth Caramel review. Peace.